Understanding crashed over Boone like a cold wave. So you stayed to guard their memory. We stayed because someone had to. Because running felt like giving up everything we'd ever loved. He looked between these remarkable women who'd chosen grief and isolation over safety and felt something shift in his chest. They hadn't just survived tragedy, they'd transformed it into strength. I used to think courage meant not being afraid, he said slowly. But watching you two, I think maybe it means being afraid and choosing to stay anyway. Kaya's hand joined her sister's on his arm. And what do you choose, Boone Carter? The way she said his name made it sound like something precious. He looked into their faces, saw acceptance there instead of judgment, strength instead of pity. I choose to stay, he said quietly, at least until morning. But even as he said it, he wondered if morning would find him able to leave at all, because somewhere in the space between fear and courage, he'd discovered a version of himself worth becoming. Dawn broke clear and sharp, the storm finally exhausted. Boone woke to find himself, lying between the sisters on the thick furs, their breathing deep and even on either side of him. Sometime during the night, they'd drawn close together for warmth, and now their bodies formed a tangle of limbs and shared heat that made his pulse quicken. He'd crossed more than lines during that long night, in whispered conversations by firelight, in touches that grew bolder as the hours passed, in the way. They'd looked at him when he proved he could stand his ground. He'd crossed into territory he'd never imagined existed. Ayanna stirred first, her dark eyes opening to find him watching her. Instead of moving away, she smiled with an intimacy that made his chest tight. "How do you feel?" she asked. The same question from the night before, but weighted with different meaning now, like I've been sleeping my whole life until now. Kaya stretched on his other side, her hand finding his chest. "And now you're awake." It was true. Every sensation felt sharper, every emotion more real. The careful boundaries that had defined his existence had dissolved completely, leaving someone he barely recognized but finally understood. "I have to go back," he said, though the words felt like swallowing glass. "My family will worry." "We know," Ayanna said simply, "but you won't be going back as the same man who left." She was right. The thought of returning to his old life, the protection, the careful limits, the fear of everything that might hurt him felt impossible. Now, how could he pretend to be small when these women had shown him how large he could be? "What will you tell them?" Kaya asked. Boone considered this as he rose and began dressing in his dry clothes. What would he tell them? That he discovered courage in the arms of two Apache sisters, that he'd learned the difference between being safe and being alive. The truth, he decided that I got caught in a storm and found shelter with two remarkable women who taught me what I was capable of. Both sisters smiled at that, and the approval in their expressions warmed him more than the morning sun streaming through the windows. As he prepared to leave, Ayanna pressed something into his hand, a small carved piece of wood, smooth from years of handling. "So you remember," she said quietly. He looked down at the carving. "A hawk in flight, wings spread wide. I won't forget." "Good," Kaya said, moving to stand beside her sister, "because the man who walks out that door isn't the boy who walked in." She was absolutely right. Boone Carter had sought shelter from a storm and instead found himself transformed by two towering Apache sisters who'd seen something in him that no one else ever had. They'd challenged his fears, awakened his desires, and shown him that real strength came not from being protected, but from choosing to face whatever life demanded. As he mounted his horse and looked back at the cabin one last time, both sisters stood in the doorway watching him. The sight of them, proud, strong, unbroken by loss, burned itself into his memory. That night had changed him forever, and riding toward home, Boone knew he'd never be content with anything less than the full, dangerous, beautiful life they'd shown him was possible. The virgin rancher who'd sought shelter was gone forever, replaced by a man who'd finally learned what it meant to be truly alive. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale of transformation and courage in the untamed frontier, where destiny and human connection collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us. The virgin rancher took shelter with two towering Apache sisters. That night changed him forever. Boone Carter had never seen women like these before. When the storm drove him to their isolated cabin, he expected to find warmth and safety. Instead, he found two pairs of dark eyes studying him with an intensity that made his hands shake. The rain hammered against the wooden walls as he stood dripping in their doorway, had clutched against his chest. Ayanna, the taller sister, moved with fluid grace as she gestured him inside. Her long black hair cascaded over shoulders broader than most men he knew. Kaya, younger but no less imposing, watched from beside the fireplace, where she'd been sharpening a hunting knife. "You're soaked through," Ayanna observed, her voice carrying an accent that reminded him of wind through canyon walls. "Strip out of those clothes before you catch your death." Boone's face burned red. Back at his family's ranch, his mother still laid out his clothes each morning. At 22, he'd never been alone with one woman, let alone two who commanded space like they owned the very air. I can wait by the fire until they dry," he stammered. Kaya looked up from her blade, amusement dancing in her eyes. "You planning to sit there shivering like a wet dog all night?" The cabin felt smaller than it had from outside. Hand-woven rugs covered the wooden floor, and animal hides hung from the walls alongside tools he didn't recognize. Everything spoke of self-sufficiency, of women who needed no one to survive in this harsh country. Ayanna moved to a chest in the corner, pulling out a rough blanket. "Your modesty won't keep you warm." Boy, boy, the words stung more than it should have. He was a grown man, owned land, ran cattle. But standing here, water pooling at his boots while these women regarded him with barely concealed impatience, he felt like the sheltered child he'd always been. Thunder crashed overhead, making him jump. Both sisters remained, perfectly still, as if storms were nothing more than background noise to them. How long had they been living out here alone? Where was their family, their tribe? "The storm will rage until dawn," Kaya said, rising to her full height. She stood nearly as tall as him, her presence filling the space between them. "Question is, what kind of man will you be when morning comes?" Her words carried weight he couldn't understand. There was something in her tone, a challenge that made his pulse quicken with more than just fear. Because as he looked between the two sisters, Boone realized this night would test more than just his ability to weather the storm. It would test everything he thought he knew about himself. Boone's teeth chattered as he stood frozen in the center of their cabin, still clutching his soaked hat. The fire crackled behind Kaya, casting warm light across her angular features, but he couldn't seem to move toward its heat. "He's scared of us," Kaya said to her sister, not bothering to lower her voice. She set down her knife and crossed her arms, studying him like a puzzle that amused her. "Can you blame him?" Ayanna replied, moving closer to Boone with predatory grace. "Probably. Never saw a woman handle a blade before. Never saw women who didn't need protecting," Kaya added with a sharp smile. Boone's jaw tightened. "I'm not scared." Both sisters laughed, a sound that echoed off the cabin walls and made his cheeks burn hotter. The laughter wasn't cruel exactly, but it held knowledge he didn't possess. "Then prove it," Ayanna said, stopping just close enough that He could smell sage and wood smoke on her skin. Take off those wet clothes before you get sick. His hands trembled as he unbuttoned his shirt, hyper-aware of their eyes on him. Back home, he'd been the protected son, sheltered from the rougher edges of frontier life. His father handled the dangerous work, while Boone managed the books and tended the gentler animals. The shirt hit the floor with a wet slap. His chest, pale from years of wearing long sleeves, even in summer, looked pitiful compared to these women who moved like they'd been carved from the landscape itself. Skinny, Kaya observed, tilting her head. But there's muscle underneath. Ranch work. Cattle, he managed, wrapping the blanket around himself with shaking fingers. Our father raised horses, Ayanna said, settling into a chair that creaked under her weight. Taught us to break them without breaking their spirit. Where is he now? Boone asked before he could stop himself. The sisters exchanged a look that lasted too long. Something passed between them, a communication he couldn't interpret, but that made the air feel heavier. Gone, Kaya said simply, like everyone else. But we stayed, Ayanna added, her voice carrying an edge that made Boone's skin prickle. Someone had to. Why? The question slipped out despite his better judgment. Kaya moved to the window, peering through rain-streaked glass at the storm beyond. Because this land demands strength, and most people— She glanced back at him meaningfully. Most people would rather run than learn what they're truly capable of. The way she said it made Boone's stomach clench with equal parts fear and something else he couldn't name. Challenge? Excitement? You planning to run when morning comes? Ayanna asked, her dark eyes fixed on his face. Boone opened his mouth to answer, then realized he didn't know what he'd say. Because looking at these women who'd chosen to stay when others fled, he wondered if they saw something in him that he'd never seen in himself, and he wasn't sure he wanted to find out what it was. The storm raged outside while Boone sat wrapped in the rough blanket, watching the sisters move through their evening routine with practiced efficiency. Every gesture they made spoke of years living without men to depend on. Ayanna prepared a simple meal of dried meat and roots, her movements economical and sure. Kaya cleaned her knife with slow, deliberate strokes that made Boone's pulse quicken for reasons he didn't understand. The silence stretched between them, broken only by rain against the windows and the crackle of burning wood. You keep staring, Kaya observed without looking up. From her blade. Something you want to ask? Heat flooded Boone's cheeks. I was just wondering how long you've been alone out here. 3 winters, Ayanna answered, setting a wooden bowl beside him. The meat was tough, but seasoned with herbs that made his mouth water. Since the soldiers came through. Soldiers! The knife stopped moving in Kaya's hands. Both sisters went still, in a way that made the air feel dangerous. They were looking for raiders, Ayanna said carefully. Burned-out homesteads, stolen cattle, the kind of trouble that follows when people get desperate. Did they find who they were looking for? Another loaded glance passed between the women. Kaya resumed cleaning her knife, but her movements had turned. Sharp, aggressive. They found what they expected to find, she said, her voice flat as stone. Boone wanted to press for more, but something in their expressions warned him off. Instead, he ate in silence, acutely aware of how the blanket had slipped, to expose his shoulders. The way Ayanna's eyes lingered on his bare skin made his stomach tighten with unfamiliar heat. You're not what I expected, she said suddenly. What did you expect? Most men who end up here are running from something. Debt, the law, a woman they wronged. Her dark eyes searched his face. But you're running towards something, aren't you? The question caught him off guard. Was he? He'd left his family's ranch that morning to check on distant pastures, but the storm had driven him miles off course, or had it. I don't know what you mean. Kaya laughed, but there was no humor in it. He doesn't even know himself yet. Know what? What kind of man you really are underneath all that careful upbringing? Ayanna leaned forward close enough that he could see gold, flecks in her brown eyes. Your family kept you soft, protected. But there's something else in there, isn't there? Something that brought you to our door. Her breath warmed his face. The scent of sage and woman made his head spin. But it was her words that shook him. Because she was right. There was something inside him, something that had always felt caged by his sheltered life. The storm's getting worse, Kaya said, moving to check the door's heavy wooden bar. No one's leaving until morning. As she secured their defenses against the night, Boone wondered if the real storm wasn't outside at all. It was happening right here, inside him, where these dangerous women were awakening parts of himself he'd never known existed. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows across the cabin walls. Boone shifted on the rough wooden chair, hyper-aware of every sound the sisters made as they prepared for sleep. His clothes hung near the flames, still damp, but warming. You can't sleep sitting up. All night, Ayanna said, unrolling a thick fur beside the fireplace. There's room here. Boone's mouth went dry. The thought of lying so close to these women with only a thin blanket between him and the unknown made his heart race. I'll be fine in the chair. Kaya snorted as she settled onto her own bedroll. Pride will give you a stiff neck and cold bones, but suit yourself. As the sisters arranged themselves for sleep, Boone caught glimpses of brown skin and curved silhouettes that made him look away quickly. He'd never shared sleeping quarters with women who weren't family. Everything about this situation violated the careful boundaries his upbringing had built around him. Tell me about your ranch, Ayanna said softly, her voice carrying through the darkness. What's it like living that protected life? It's not protected, he protested, though even he could hear how weak the words sounded. No. When's the last time? You faced real danger, real choice. Boone opened his mouth to answer and realized he couldn't. His father had always handled the difficult decisions, the dangerous work. Even their cattle drives followed established safe routes. That's what I thought, Kaya murmured from her bedroll. You've been living someone else's idea of who you should be. And who do you think I should be? The question hung in the air like smoke. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains. But inside, the silence felt charged with possibility. That's not for us to decide, Ayanna said. But this storm, it's given you a chance to find out. A chance for what? To stop being the man your family made you. To discover who you'd be if you had to rely on yourself. Boone felt something shift inside his chest, like a door opening onto a room he'd never seen. These women saw something in him that nobody else had ever noticed. Not weakness to be protected, but potential to be unleashed. What if I'm not strong enough? Strength isn't about muscle, Kaya said, rolling onto her side to face him. Even in the dim firelight, her eyes gleamed with something that made his breath catch. It's about knowing what you want and taking it. Taking what? Whatever calls to you, Ayanna's voice was barely above a whisper. Whatever makes you feel alive instead of just safe. The way she said it made heat flood through him. He understood now that she wasn't just talking about courage in the abstract. She was talking about desire, about the kind of wants he'd spent his whole life suppressing. Lightning illuminated the windows, and for a moment, the cabin felt like the only solid thing in a world of storms. But Boone was beginning to realize that the real tempest wasn't outside. It was inside him, growing stronger with every word these dangerous women spoke. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to let it loose. Sleep eluded Boone. Every time he closed his eyes, he became aware of the sisters breathing in the darkness. The rustle of fur against skin when they shifted position. The chair had grown unbearably uncomfortable, but moving to the floor beside them felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was ready to cross. Around midnight, a new sound cut through the storms. Noise, scratching at the door accompanied by low whining. Kaya sat up instantly, knife already in her hand. "Coyote pack," she whispered. Storms driven them down from the high country. More scratching, more insistent now. The wooden door was thick, but Boone could hear claws working at the gaps around the frame. "How many?" Ayanna asked, rising silently, to her feet. "At least 3, maybe more." Kaya moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutters. "They're hungry, desperate." The scratching intensified, joined by growling that made Boone's skin crawl. He'd heard stories of coyote packs, attacking humans when prey was scarce, but he'd never faced them himself. "What do we do?" he asked, hating how his voice shook. Both sisters looked at him with expressions he couldn't read. Then Ayanna moved to the wall where several rifles hung on wooden pegs. "We defend our home," she said simply, checking the weapons. "Load. Question is, are you going to help or hide?" The words hit him like a slap. He thought of all the times his father had sent him to the house when danger threatened, all the times he'd been protected instead of included. "Don't know how to fight coyotes." "Then you'll learn?" Kaya tossed him a heavy wooden club from beside the fireplace. "Real simple. They come through that door. You hit them until they stop moving." The weight of the club in his hands felt foreign, but somehow right. His palms were slick with sweat, but for the first time since arriving, he didn't feel completely helpless. "There's another way," Ayanna said, studying his face in the firelight. "We could wait them out, hope they lose interest and move on." "Is that what you'd do if I wasn't here?" The sisters exchanged one of their loaded glances. "No," Kaya admitted. "We'd go out there and drive them off. Show them this territory belongs to us. Then that's what we do." The words surprised him as much as them. But looking at these women who'd chosen to stay when others fled, who faced danger instead of hiding from it, something inside him shifted. "You sure?" Ayanna asked, her voice softer than he'd heard it. "Once we go out there, there's no taking it back. You'll have crossed a line." Boone gripped the club tighter and moved toward the door. His heart hammered against his ribs. But underneath the fear was something else. Excitement? Purpose. Maybe it's time I crossed some lines. For the first time since he'd arrived, both sisters smiled at him with something that looked like approval, and Boone realized that was exactly what he'd been hungry for all along. The cold night air hit Boone's bare chest like a physical blow as they stepped onto the covered porch. Rain drove sideways in sheets, but he could make out lean shapes moving in the darkness beyond the cabin's edge. Yellow eyes reflected the light spilling from the doorway. "Stay between us," Kaya instructed, raising her rifle. "Don't swing that club unless one gets past our shots." But as they moved into the storm, the pack circled wider than expected. One of the coyotes, bolder than the others, darted around the cabin's far corner. Before either sister could react, it was charging straight at Boone. Time slowed. The animal's snarling face filled his vision. Teeth bared and muscles bunched for the leap. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to call for help, to let someone else handle the danger. Instead, he planted his feet and swung the club. The impact jarred his arms to the shoulders. The coyote yelped and rolled sideways, stunned, but not finished. It scrambled to its feet, blood streaming from its muzzle, eyes now fixed on him with pure hatred. "Again!" Ayanna shouted over the storm. The animal lunged once more. This time, Boone was ready. He sidestepped and brought the club down hard across its spine. The coyote collapsed and didn't get up. The rest of the pack melted back into the darkness. Spooked by the sudden violence and their packmates' stillness, within moments only the storm remained. Boone stood over the fallen animal, chest heaving, rain washing the sweat from his skin. His whole body shook, but not with fear, with something else. "Entirely." "Well," Kaya said, lowering her rifle, Look at that. Ayana moved to his side so close her warmth cut through the cold wind. When she looked up at him, her expression held something new, something that made heat pool low in his belly despite the freezing rain. "How do you feel?" she asked. Boone searched for words and came up empty. How did he feel? In a way he'd never experienced, raw, powerful, like he'd shed an old skin and found something stronger underneath. Different. He finally managed, good different or bad different. He met her eyes, saw his reflection in them, and barely recognized the man looking back. Still slight, still young, but something fundamental had changed in his posture, his expression. Good. Definitely. Good. Kaya laughed. A sound rich with approval. Told you there was something else in there. They helped him drag the coyote's body away from the cabin before heading back inside. As Ayana barred the door behind them, Boone caught her watching him, with an intensity that made his pulse quicken all over again. "You're not the same man who walked through that door," she observed. She was right. The scared boy who'd sought shelter from the storm was gone. In his place stood someone who'd faced real danger and discovered he was strong enough to handle it. "What happens now?" he asked. Both sisters moved closer, their presence surrounding him with heat and possibility. "Now," Kaya said, her voice low and intimate, "we find out what other lines you're ready to cross." The way she said it made clear they weren't talking about coyotes anymore, and for the first time in his life, Boone felt ready for whatever came next. Back inside the cabin, Boone's wet skin steamed in the firelight. The sisters watched him towel off with expressions that had changed completely from when he'd first arrived. Where before they'd seen a scared boy, now they studied him like they were seeing a man for the first time. "Sit!" Ayana commanded, patting the fur beside her. "You're shaking." But it wasn't from cold anymore. The adrenaline from the fight had awakened something primal in him, something that responded to the way Kaya was looking at him with newfound respect. As he settled beside Ayana, she pressed a cup of herbal tea into his hands. Her fingers brushed his, and this time he didn't pull away. The contact sent heat racing up his arm. "Tell us about your family," she said, her voice softer than he'd heard it. "Why they kept you so protected." The question should have made him defensive. But instead, he found himself speaking freely. "My mother lost 3 babies before me. When I survived, she couldn't bear the thought of losing me too. And my father—" He paused, searching for words. "He saw me as something precious that needed guarding, instead of a man who needed testing," Kaya observed, settling on his other side. The warmth of their bodies pressed close made his head spin. These women who'd seemed so dangerous hours ago now felt like harbors in a storm he was finally ready to weather. "What about you?" he asked. "Why did you really stay when your people left?" The sisters exchanged another of their meaningful looks. Then Ayana sighed, a sound that held years of pain. "The soldiers came looking for raiders," she said quietly. "But they didn't care about guilt or innocence. They wanted someone to pay for the stolen cattle, the burned homesteads. They took the men first," Kaya continued, her voice hard as stone. "Our father, our brothers, our cousins said they'd be held until the real raiders were found. Were they ever found? No. Because the soldiers had already decided who was guilty. Ayana's hand found his arm, her touch, both comfort and connection. The men never came back.